grateful, Yael, not only for the introduction, but for the welcome and the invitation. It's special to be here and talk about this book because this was the first place I spoke about this book back in November of 2011, when I had just begun the research and was first trying to figure out what this book was about. And then again in 2016, when I had done much of the research, but was still trying to figure out what this book was about, I spoke about it with a number of you in this room, and some others. That was in 2016. So now the book is out. It feels a little bit like an artifact of my past, as books tend to, but coming here makes it feel very much like a continuous conversation. So I appreciate your coming here and appreciate the chance to talk to you. I'm not going to present the book exactly, but I am going to talk a little bit about one aspect of the book and think about what might be its implications for some things that the rest of us work on and study. Okay. Start here. So a guy named Nehemiah Adams. He was the author of a book of what's called consolation literature. It was published in the 1850s, designed to make people feel better in the wake of great life tragedies. So he shared with his readers a personal dilemma that interested me very much. He had lost his young daughter the previous year, and he hesitated at the prospect of how he might commemorate the first anniversary of her tragic passing. So specifically, what he was unsure about was when exactly to commemorate this event. The Gregorian date of her death would seem, of course, to be the obvious occasion. That's typically what we mean when we say that something is the anniversary of an event. It's the corresponding coordinate on a Gregorian calendar. But the problem for Nehemiah Adams and for his wife was that this would entail marking their daughter's death and her burial on a different day of the weekly cycle than when it happened. This is, of course, true for all anniversaries. We don't ordinarily give it a second thought. We don't worry about the fact that our birthdays migrate across the week from year to year, deviating most of the time from the actual weekday of our birth. Some of us in this room, I imagine, don't even know what day of the week we were born on. And I'd be surprised if many of you, even those of you who study U.S. history for a living, could identify the day of the week when, say, the Continental Congress declared independence from the British Empire in 1776. And yet we can sympathize with this father's dilemma. Because when we actually remember an event, not simply commemorate, when we actually remember it, and we remember it in a profound and a vivid manner, we typically actually do recall its place within the weekly cycle. We recall how it was embedded in the patterned rhythms of our weekly lives. This phenomenon has a history, and it's that history that has interested me for a long time. This became, in fact, a common mental habit in 19th century America. This is something that we can see in the diaries and letters of ordinary Americans whenever they recollected or narrated events in the very recent past. They would remember it by the weekday on which it happened. We can also see this in courtroom testimony. In other words, when the stakes of accurate memory were especially elevated. So to just give you one example, an 1839 trial in Philadelphia for an assault and attempted rape. At that trial, witnesses expressed far more confidence about the weekly calendar than any of the other temporal details surrounding the alleged crime. So the complainant, a woman named Margaret Carr, described the assault as having occurred, quote, on a Friday 9 or 10 weeks ago, though she quote, could not, quote, recollect the day of the month. Now, presumably the weekday on which she was assaulted was easier to recall with confidence because, as she testified, it was the day before Carr left Mrs. Hess's boarding house, and such transitions typically took place on Saturdays. Another witness in the same trial, a woman named Catherine Knodel, a 12-year-old domestic servant, was able to place Margaret Carr at the scene of the alleged crime, quote, about the 20th about 11 o'clock, it was on a Friday. Right, so an approximate Gregorian date, about the 20th, an approximate time, about 11 o'clock, but a certain weekday. It was a Friday. Under cross-examination, she explained that she recalled, though somewhat tentatively, the numerical date only because she had seen it in a newspaper, but that she didn't know for certain which month it had been because she read German, but not English, could decipher the numbers, but not the words. Okay. But still, there was no question in her mind that it was Friday, because she was attuned to weekly rhythms, not only because she was a wage worker who received 50 cents every week on the same day, but also because her housekeeping tasks conformed to weekly routines. As she put it, I always scrub my entry on Friday morning at 11 o'clock. That's how she knew it was Friday. This was a cleaning schedule confirmed by another trial witness. So, assault trial, people have to remember when something happened, and their most reliable, most confident memories are linked to the weekly calendar and to their rhythms of and habits of weekly life. This was not a unique case. Antebellum courtroom testimony offers many, many striking examples of the same pattern of weekly memory. An 1837 trial in New York City, a witness to some mayhem from the previous year involving a celebrated boxer, recalled that, quote, "The riot took place on a Monday evening. I do not recall the date." Another one, 1841 Berkeley trial. A witness confessed that having entered and robbed a house over a year prior on a Sunday night in the early part of September. A survey of dozens and dozens of these trial reports that I did in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle between 1840 and 1860 shows a pretty persistent pattern. The court reporter would always place the events under examination in a Gregorian dateline, but witnesses who actually remembered something relied more frequently, more confidently, and more accurately on the weekly calendar, even when they were narrating events set more than 10 days in the past. In other words, even when set beyond the temporal horizon for which weekday references are most useful.
The line is crazy. I'm sorry that I'm playing around.
No, I'm fine. Yeah, I didn't think I was having an episode. So. That's fine. Okay, right. So, you might think that people use weekdays within 10 days because that's when it's useful to identify things by the day of the week. But people did it even when it was 6 months old or a year old. Okay, fine. So, the utility or the centrality of the weekly calendar as a mnemonic structure, which is really what I'm talking about here, or as a mnemonic device, or as a mental map of time, is a very significant and suggestive feature of our own experience of modern 7-day timekeeping. I think it actually might even help explain the remarkable spread and the remarkable persistence of this very peculiar artificial time unit that is the 7-day week. But notice that the capacity or the tendency of witnesses to confidently recall whether something took place, say, on a Wednesday or a Thursday, depends on more than just the observance of a weekly cycle. Simply having a week doesn't give you that. What it depends on is a weekly cycle in which each day of the week has a distinctive association within a 7-day schedule. Because a society in which the weekly cycle does no more than distinguish labor from leisure, or the profane from the sacred, or one climactic day from 6 prosaic ones, would not be as helpful or as powerful in that regard. In such a timekeeping scheme, in such a timekeeping culture, a grieving father would actually be much less likely to say that it feels wrong to commemorate a Thursday event on a Friday. The only point is that it's not on the weekend. So we might differentiate two different kinds of two different tendencies of weekly timekeeping, two distinct 7-day rhythms. The first is essentially bimodal. It comes in two modes. It's a series of identical ticks followed by a special talk. Right? But the second type is actually fundamentally heterogeneous, like the musical scale of a do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. So unlike the bimodal week, the heterogeneous week doesn't actually lend itself to any clear two-part division or into any fractional division at all, other than its 7 irreducibly distinct constituents. Nor does it have a clear hierarchical order, nor does it even have an obvious starting point. That would be the heterogeneous week. That type of weekly timekeeping, heterogeneous, well, we'll call for now heterogeneous timekeeping, like the bimodal one, has an ancient pedigree. This is a different ancient pedigree from the one that the bimodal one has. The bimodal one comes from the Jews. The heterogeneous week can claim ancestry from the Roman planetary week, which counted a cycle of 7 days, each day identified with the dominion of one of 7 celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets that you can see from Earth without help. That introduced this kind of week. That kind of week has many echoes, including in modern life, but principally that's the paradigm. And it's that week, of course, that provides the names of the 7 weekdays in most Indo-European languages. But the thing about Roman planetary weeks is that they had no mnemonic utility because, so far as we can tell, nothing memorably distinct ever happened in the Roman world on a particular weekday. And the particular weekdays attached to each planet didn't actually correspond to special cycles of activity in Roman civic life or Roman social life. The modern American week, by contrast, has as one of its innovative features, and to my mind, one of its most powerful constitutive functions, the rhythmic scheduling of particular activities on particular days. So a simple thing, but that's actually extraordinarily consequential for modern 7-day timekeeping and for the kind of modern mental mapping that I'm talking about here today. This is one of the principal findings of my research into the lives of ordinary Americans in the first half of the 19th century. Although the bimodal tick-tock of Sunday and other days remained prominent, even in some ways dominant, increasingly more and more Americans had habitual activities that were pegged to specific weekdays. Classes, cleaning routines, club meetings, matinees. They would have a consistent weekday for receiving a newspaper, or a consistent weekday for posting a letter, or for redeeming a pawned garment, or for visiting another enslaved person on a nearby plantation. My book about the week makes the case that mid-century Americans, especially, but not exclusively, those who were dwelling in cities, reading newspapers, attending schools, using the post, drawing wages, joining voluntary associations, or engaging in domestic service, were increasingly likely to have distinctive experiences of particular days of the week. Okay, so what does that mean? Why does that matter beyond my own interest in the curious and diverse workings of the 7-day calendar, which is in fact really what interests me. But why might it matter to anybody else? The implications of this finding for people who study the history of the United States are in one sense fairly narrow but possibly useful. Right? When we examine events or developments that took place in, let's say, antebellum America, historians probably ought to keep in mind that those events took place on particular weekdays and that those developments unfolded along weekly timelines, which might conceivably make a difference to some of the observations we make or some of the stories we tell, or maybe not, right? But good to know. So that's one thing. Thinking about it a little bit more broadly, we might note the historical significance of this new calendar consciousness in and of itself. This shift toward a heightened sensitivity to the rhythms of a heterogeneous week, to the complex differentiation of the 7 different days, I would say epitomized and intensified and reinforced the complex social and economic forces that made U.S. society in the first half of the 19th century a recognizably modern society. So over the course of the 19th century, the week intensified its grip on popular experience in the United States And people were much more disciplined by the week and much more likely to know and care where they stood in the weekly cycle, not because most Americans started caring more about the Sabbath, or about astrology, or about weekly introspection, though many of them did, but that's not why the week had as strong a grip as it did, not because any of the other things that weekly timekeeping had reinforced in earlier periods, and not only because the lines between weekday and weekend hardened in some industrial contexts, but rather because Americans became more intensely disciplined by another kind of weekly cycle. It was a cycle that bore the dominant imprint of coordinated and networked activities with strangers. That's what the week signified, and that's what the week essentially disciplined people to. These activities could be commercial exchanges, or synchronized labor, or periodical publication rhythms, or wage payment, or educational curricula, or just the diverse meeting schedules that were designed to allow strangers to organize their lives. So thus it was a calendar that highlighted and even naturalized the presence and the activities of masses of other people. It was a calendar of social time more than it was a calendar of agricultural time, or ritual time, or festive time, or even labor time. So this would offer us yet another way of thinking about things like market revolutions, or the spread of capitalism, urbanization, or the rise of American mass society. This kind of week was a calendar for the kind of mass society that emerged in the 19th century. And if you're thinking about what that looked like, the week is actually a really interesting place to begin even. But that's not what I want to consider today. I want to consider with you today something a little different, something even more general in the study of history. Not something that's specific to 19th century America, but I want to consider the implications of this modern 7-day calendar, not only for charting events in antebellum United States or for our understanding of 19th century time consciousness, but for a peculiar concept that has become a powerful intellectual tool for expanding and for redefining the study of the past. And that is this thing that we call everyday life. I'm confident that most of you have heard this expression, both in academic and non-academic contexts. In academic context, it's extraordinarily familiar. We have countless articles, monographs, and book series and conferences, all with the phrase everyday life in their titles. It is a trope. In some sense, it's a cliche, but it's also a banner for a particular kind of social history. Those of us, and I include myself among them, who take our charge to be the study of the ordinary, routinely use the figure of the everyday, both to mark a field of study, and we're studying everyday life, not whatever you think historians study, but also to implicitly argue for the greater significance of what we study. The fact that it is everyday life not only supposed to convey what it is that we're studying, but also to imply that it is of some sense superior significance and moment. Okay. This rhetorical move has itself a long history. Within the study of history, I would say this rhetorical move originated in the first half of the previous century in France with Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre, and the call of the Annales school for a rejection or at least a depreciation of event history. So in some ways, the concept of everyday life was recruited in a battle against the history of the event, the singular event. This revolution of the Annales school in early 20th century France entailed most prominently a shift in temporal framing, a shift in temporal perspective, and the day played a monumental rhetorical role in this shift. So Fernand Braudel, probably the most influential and prominent advocate of this new approach, made the point explicitly. Braudel was interested in extended periods of time, or what he called the longue durée, and it entailed a disavowal of the time span of the individual day. What he was seeking to replace was a temporal framework as he described it, quote, proportionate to individuals, to daily life, la vie quotidienne, to our illusions, to our hasty awareness. Above all, he wrote, the time of the chronicle and the journalist. Not, in other words, the time of the proper historian. Chroniclists and chroniclers and journalists had the perspective of the day. The historian needed to jettison that framework for a different one. And in rejecting the framework of the chronicle, the journalist, in rejecting what he called the hasty awareness, social and economic historians sought to demote the day, and the concept of everyday life actually provided them a useful and a very pointed replacement. The everyday, as opposed to the day, asserts the importance of what is repeated, what is reiterated, what is shared across a series of formally identical time units. So whatever might distinguish one day from another is weeded out as just so much distracting noise. The everyday has to talk about what every day shares. Replacing the day with the everyday is thus not simply about lengthening the durée. It's not simply about expanding the historical lens to take in more and more stuff that happened in the past. It's about gaining access to the aspects of the past that don't register at all when the day is taken to be the unit of study. So in the words of the experimental writer Georges Perec, the French author who, though not a historian, has probably contributed as much to my own understanding of my project as any other, put it, quote, the daily papers talk of everything except the daily. The papers annoy me. They teach me nothing, he wrote in a piece originally published in 1973. What they recount doesn't concern me, doesn't ask me questions, doesn't answer the questions I ask or would like to ask. Instead, what Perec says he wants to know is, quote, what's really going on, what we're experiencing, the rest, all the rest, where is it? How should we take account of? Question, describe what happens every day and recurs every day, the banal, the quotidian, the obvious, the common, the ordinary, the infraordinary, the background noise, the habitual. There's lots to say about this as a prospectus for a literary career, a tragically shortened literary career in his case, or as a scholarly agenda for historians or for students of history, for that matter, especially interest in what he provocatively calls the infraordinary. But I want to call attention to the crucial role of the quotidian, the everyday, in that litany, and in his rejection of the model of the daily newspaper. The daily paper insists, for commercial reasons as well as formal ones, on the difference between one day and the day that came before it, or the day that comes next. And that's why you have to buy the next paper. The study of every life, by contrast, insists upon the fundamental sameness on daily time as a series of repetitions. I would add this is equally true of what is probably the most famous and self-conscious French invocation of the idea of the quotidien. It would be Michel de Certeau's landmark 1980 work, which is translated into English as The Practice of Everyday Life. That might seem at first to lie very far from the interests of Brodel and the Annales school, because he, de Certeau, is interested in the inventive and the idiosyncratic ways in which individuals, or sometimes local communities, can deviate from the norms or subvert the dominant ideologies or repurpose those same larger structures that economic and social historians take as their stable objects of study. But the concept of the everyday in his, de Certeau's, philosophical and sociological critique emphasizes repetition. The inventive and idiosyncratic tactics of meaning-making and even resistance that are adopted by users only accrete significance in their repetition. So the figure of the day stands for the possibility of that repetitive accretion. whenever people talk about the everyday, then that is essentially what they have in mind. So here's the paradox that might have occurred to you. All these attempts to diminish the significance of the individual day as a unit of experience or as a unit of history, by speaking instead of every day, nonetheless rely on the day as the means of making this point. Right? The everyday disavows the day, but also depends on it, to represent the aspects of past experience that are repeated or that are uneventful or ordinary or infra-ordinary. We don't speak about hourly life or annual life. We don't study the practices of every week life. And for many reasons, we don't frame the subject as a history of continuous life. It still is about, fundamentally, the relationship between one day and another. Partly, I think this is because we recognize the presumptive claim of the day to be the basic building block of historical awareness. It's rooted not only in the long-standing but increasingly attenuated hegemony of a daily news cycle, the idea that public events unfold in daily increments, but also in the basic rhythms of sleep and wakefulness that lead us to, for example, ask one another, what happened today? What happened yesterday? What are you doing tomorrow? But it's not just a matter of using the word every day to destabilize or dethrone the one unit of time that has long reigned among historians and social scientists as the king of calendar units. It's also because we need to take seriously the temporal experiences and the temporal categories of the people and the societies that we're studying. So if we're studying 19th century America, and notice that as practices like keeping a diary and reading a daily newspaper proliferated, our historical subjects did increasingly experience time as passing in days. So we need to think in days too, not exclusively, but still attentively and sympathetically. But then we also need to think about how their days fit into larger calendars and larger temporal frameworks. So the everyday, the concept of the everyday, asserts the homogeneity of days, right? That's what it's doing. But so many of the societies that historians study resist that homogenization because they introduce differences of all kinds into the sequence of days. So the fact that in 19th century America, if I'm correct, the society in which people lived in different ways by the week ought to have implications for how they experienced their days too, and for what days might have to do with the repeated, the uneventful, the extraordinary aspects of their lives. So the interesting thing about weeks in relation to days is that weeks, of course, are composed of days, but crucially, their job is to divide days, which means they are potential sources of resistance, or at least complication, to the homogenizing project of the concept of the everyday. But different kinds of weekly timekeeping do this differently. To return to my earlier dichotomy, bimodal weeks, or what we could call dominical weeks, and weeks organized around a Sunday, or a Sabbatarian calendar, focus on a single day of rest. Those kinds of calendar schemes, those kinds of regimes, and I should say that I've often suspected that those schemes and those regimes of weekly timekeeping are actually especially conspicuous in modern Israeli society. But those schemes create a category of the everyday within the week. In other words, the bimodal week divides the days of our lives into ordinary time, weekday experience, and extraordinary time, or Sabbath experience, or Sunday experience. This division, in turn, provides a powerful paradigm, unlike anything else found in modern calendars, for the distinction between ordinary and extraordinary more generally. I think about the relation between the day and the everyday. The bimodal week actually builds that dichotomy in by saying that some days are ordinary and everyday, and other days are not. So this could be applied to things that aren't even days, aren't even time. So Hegel famously spoke of the Sunday of life That's not a day. It's a realm of humble renunciation of individual interests. Right? But also he did so to gesture towards some post-historical moment. A notion, by the way, that echoes Jewish and Christian visions of the Messianic age as a kind of perpetual Sabbath. So that's right the extraordinary day that is the Sunday of life, or the symbolic Sabbath is one kind of time. By contrast, the other days of the week together represent all things mundane, all things prosaic, even all things plebeian. So the Yiddish expression, wochendige Menschen, literally means people of the week. But what it really means is weekday people, as opposed to Shabbos Menschen, as opposed to special day or Sabbath people, as opposed to notables. In other words, it's a populist plebeian conception of people expressed with the paradigm of weekly timekeeping. This is also what Sly and the Family Stone meant when they sang the praises of everyday people. But it's actually more precise in the Yiddish expression because it's not everyday people, it's every weekday people. The Wednesday or Thursday of life, one might say, is most of life itself, just not the special parts. And most people, most experience, ordinariness, uneventfulness, is therefore built into the week, not because all days are alike, but because all weekdays are alike in that timekeeping frame. But the heterogeneous week that interests me and that I see as, in many ways, becoming much more important in the United States in the early 19th century does something quite different. Because what the heterogeneous week does is insists that no two consecutive days are identical. It's a remarkable timekeeping calendar in that way. Right? All days are formally identical in size and shape, in duration, but they're not even really formally identical as the heterogeneous week describes it. This is especially clear in cultures that don't number their days the way, say, Hebrew does, or Arabic, or Greek, or Portuguese, but they name their days, and name their days in a way that doesn't lend itself to order or hierarchy. Instead, it simply says that days come in 7 varieties, and no two in a row will resemble each other. Okay, so the introduction to this daily difference, whether it's through astrology, right? Today is the day of Jupiter, and then tomorrow would then be obviously have to be the day of Venus, or through complex grids of ominous and auspicious weekdays, good luck days, bad luck days, organized around the week, or through the kinds of things that structure daily difference in many periods of the modern world, like weekly television schedules or weekly child custody arrangements, push us to think of other patterns and other metaphors for getting at the bigger picture, for framing what seems both endlessly recurrent and also what seems fleeting in the historical experiences of the people that we study, or in our own experiences too. So thank you. That's what I have to say, and I'm happy to answer questions about that or about the book.